So if you're leading a low performing school, you've got to find an example of a school that went from worst to first, that went from the bottom to the top in just 2 years. So for today's episode, what I want to do is I want to show you an example of the worst performing football team that went to first in just 2 years and how this can apply to your world. So, yes, I'm talking about the Indiana football team. They went from irrelevant to elite in just 2 years. Now, you may not be a football fan, and to be honest with you, I really didn't watch Indiana football all that much this year, but I'm always looking for an example of a leader who took a low performing organization and brought it to the very top in a very short period of time. And so, leaders should always be looking for the best examples of leadership everywhere, anywhere, not just in areas that you're interested in, but areas that you're not interested in. So today, what I want to do is I want to draw correlations between a school that is a D or an F, a low performing, perennially unsuccessful school, and show you how, if you apply the traits that Kurt Cignetti, head coach of Indiana, put into place there, using our We Factor framework, you can actually turn your school around in 1 year or 2 years. It is definitely possible, and there are so many schools that I work with that have done that. So let's get started. Now, if you stick around and watch this video, I'm going to show you the 6 steps, the We Factor framework, that you can utilize to become a high performing school immediately. And then I'm going to show you the resources that we have that you can actually apply right now to find out where you're missing out on those things. So you want to stick around to the end of the show, and we will have those resources there for you to check out. All right, so when we're talking about the We Factor framework, the very first thing we have to understand is that Kurt Cignetti was not the reason that they won. He was the catalyst for the reason that they won. In other words, we as a team have to come together in order to be successful. That's what a we factor is. And a we factor consists of 2 elements. Number one is the work that we do every single day to become better people. That's, in other words, we are shaping each other, sharpening each other. The second part to the we factor is once you get the work done of getting people unified around a common vision, now you're ready to execute the E side of the we factor, and those are the endeavors. The endeavors are the things that you perform each and every day to actually become the best at what you do. So let's break that down and let's draw some correlations between the we factor that you need in schools and how you could take some ideas from the Indiana football team and apply it to your school. So the very first part of the we factor is actually right in the middle of that W. It is called the me. And if you want to be a successful leader of a successful school, we is not about me, but it does start with me. We starts with me. And when Indiana made the decision to hire Kurt Cignetti, he wasn't a traditional leader. He didn't go up through the traditional ways. What he had done is he turned all those schools around in a short period of time and made them successful immediately. So why is that important to you? If you want to turn your school around, it starts with you as the leader. In other words, me stands for my example, my character, my organization, my planning, my attention to detail. And yes, I'm going to say this, even your OCD characteristics. If you are not really focused on the details and really a detail-oriented person, you cannot go from worst to first in any period of time, much less a year or two. The next thing that he focused on is the second part of that we factor, which is unity with leaders. And what is really important here to keep in mind is that he established quickly an Indiana first mentality. That was his focus. Everyone that's in the program has to be focused on Indiana first. So this is the first step before you start implementing systems. Because if you don't have a common vision or a common unifying characteristic about your organization, you cannot go from worst to first. And so what he did is he established clear roles, he established accountability, and he established communication. It's really important that you understand that unity is the first step you have to establish if you're going to turn a school around. Without unity, you can't have community, and it takes a community to turn your school around. So, thinking about that, he had an expectation for his employees. He didn't want just compliance with the expectations, he wanted commitment to them. And in doing that, you have to understand that when you're looking at developing unity between leadership and the people on the team, unity is a two-way street. In other words, you want people to have conversations. You want people to be encouraged to ask questions, internalize, even challenge ideas because you're trying to get people's minds and their hearts into the organization. That does not happen without building that unity and that camaraderie within your staff and in your community. Another thing that's real important is that when he was establishing that unity between the leaders and the players, the leaders and the community, he really wanted to focus on building that trust. He did not define following leadership as a personality issue. He defined it as a discipline issue. So, how does that apply to you? It's really important as leaders that we have to remember that people are going to be challenged. And when they are challenged, they're pushed out of their comfort zone and into their discomfort zone, which is going to create stress and anxiety. And so, as a leader, you have to really recognize where the emotional elevation is and be prepared to confront that in a positive way that gets people back to discipline is the key to turning our school around. We need to be focused on learning, and that requires a learning mindset. In other words, write this down. We, the leaders, and we, the teachers, are the first learners that are focused on our own growth first, because growth from the adults in the building is the catalyst for growth in the students in the building. Now, if you think about all of the work that has to go on, it really focuses on two things: character and unity. When you have character and unity, you develop discipline. And that's the work that you have to turn your school from a low performing school into a high performing school. Now, let's shift over to the E side of the we factor and let's learn about the we factor there and figure out how we can learn from the Indiana football team and apply that to our school so we can turn it around. So the bottom part of the E is where we start. It's the foundation of our endeavors, and that word is structure. And in structure, what we need to understand is that Indiana implemented really consistent and rigid daily schedules, meetings, expectations, practices, flow. And I want you to think about this. The purpose of this is to reduce the anxiety and stress and to increase the performance and increase the consistency of performance. Without structure, we're going to fall apart. Think of the structure as the foundation of your house. And if your classrooms and in your schools do not have structure, chances are you're not going to be successful. When you are trying to turn a school around, you are going to fall to the level of your systems and the level of your structures. And many of the schools that are underperforming are not underperforming because they don't have the talent. It's because they don't have the structure for the talent to accelerate its performance. So we have to understand that Indiana implemented this mindset of every play has a life routine. And he broke this down to a 6-second mindset, which is about the length of a play in football. Everything was around how do we optimize this 6-second play? And so turn that into your instruction, turn that into your school. We can apply that to everything in your school can be broken down into the 5-minute chunk of instruction, the 5 minutes within this meeting, the 5 minutes within this PLC. If you start focusing on building 5-minute routines, that's going to force people to be very focused and is going to help them be successful. If you want to change behaviors, you have to focus on building routines because routines is what shapes behavior and what increases discipline. All right, the next level endeavors has to deal with our culture. And one of the things that Signetti really believed about his success as a team is that long-term goals exist to do one thing, and that is align behavior. So in other words, he wasn't hyper focused on the goal. He just established it and didn't do a whole lot of preaching about the goal. Everything was about the behavior and whether or not it is leading the team toward the goal or away from the goal. So, how do we get really focused on the long term goal of becoming an A and B school and not get really lost in the weeds shooting for that goal in our daily and short term work? And the answer to that is you have to create short term goals to drive your daily success. So, in other words, he focused really on winning the rep, winning the drill, winning the day, winning the play. So, let's go ahead and let's think about this. If you want to be a high performing school, an A and B rated school, you need to have A and B rated lessons, A and B rated lesson planning, A and B rated execution of the lessons. Am I providing the very best performance in this 5 minute segment? How can we get more productivity out of this 5 minute block, more out of you in this 1 minute reading section, more out of you as you're showing your work? Motivation and inspiration are just platitudes without a short term goal of what we want to reach in the next minute to 5 minutes. The mindset in your school or in your classroom, is it focused on active learning, busting your tail from bell to bell? If it's not focused on active learning, optimizing every minute, busting your tail from minute to minute, then chances are you're already not going to be successful. What you do in practice is what you will do on the day of the game. What you do at the desk is what you will do on the test. And your culture is the thing that is going to really dictate whether or not you're going to be at your very best on the day of the test. Now, the final thing I really want to focus on is that word strategy. That's the top level in the endeavor part of the We Factor framework. And when you're thinking about strategy, the success of the team is driven around the highest probability of success. In other words, the plays and the actions and the steps that are going to get the greatest gains. Now, I want you to think about your classroom. In your classroom, you have 100 standards. There's all kinds of things that kids have to learn, but you're trying to win the game. And in winning the big game, the things that are the highest probability of success are the highest leverage skills, the most essential skills. And what most schools are doing that are falling into that CDF range is they're focusing on all the skills. They're focused on the most skills, but they're not focused on the most essential skills. In other words, the few and critical. So rather than focusing on more, you're focusing on what matters most. That's the key. What matters most in your school success? What skills matter most in your grade level success, in your reading success? And with that, you have to understand that strategy is about this. What is going to move the needle fastest? And so with that, I see a lot of people that are focused on all the skills and they're just doing. They're doing more and more and more, and they're unsuccessful. Why? Because they're not really narrowing the focus on the target. What are the most probable skills that are on the test? What are the lowest performing skills that we know are going to be on the test? That's what your focus has got to be on. And use the data to drive feedback. So we're going to make a plan to teach those skills, execute delivering a lesson on those skills, and then what are we going to do? We're going to assess to see if we're learning, and then use the data to do what? Drive feedback. So looking at that We Factor framework, where do you feel like your team is struggling? Are you struggling with me, the leader? Are there people in your team that are struggling with their me's? In other words, they don't have the character or organization to be successful. Are you struggling with the unity? In other words, people are not following the leader. They're not trusting in the leader. They're not learning from the leader. Are they not developing the unity with their players on the other side of the work? In other words, they're not building those strong relationships to inspire students to really give it their best to grow. Are they struggling with the structure? In other words, we don't have predictable structure. We don't have routines. That's why we're not successful. Are we struggling with number 5? We don't have the culture. We have apathy that's rampant. Kids are not trying. Kids are not giving their best. Or finally, do we not have a really strategic plan of action? We're lacking strategy. We're doing all the things, but not doing the things that are going to get us the highest growth, the highest probability of success. Now, if you want to know how your school is doing and you want to really figure out where you are struggling and what you need to grow in, this is the thing that I have for you. It's called the School Excellence Checklist. This is a document that I created that's free to download. check it over. Right now is the time that you need to be doing a needs assessment of your school and finding out where you're struggling. So it's down in the show notes. Download that free resource. Go over it with your leadership team, go over it with your staff, and find out where you are struggling. If you want to be the best, you have to stop doing what the rest are doing. You want to stop doing the most things and start doing the most strategic things. The school excellence checklist will help you identify your strengths and your struggles. And then guess what? Using the we factor framework, it will help you figure out what is the first step you need to take, the second step you need to take. Finally, I want you to remember this. We is not about me, but it starts with me. And you can turn your school around in 1 to 2 years if you're willing to do the hard work of building better people. And at the end of the day, all kids deserve the very best school. So if you need anything from us, all you got to go do is go to winkheadlearning.com, check out our resources, check out how we help people, and let's see if we can work together to help you become the best at defeating student failure.